Sounds good.
All right. Hey, Kyle, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, Michael, doing good. It's a little bit crazy. I don't know if
Yes.
you heard, but we just had an earthquake in Utah, as
Oh,
well as the whole coronavirus thing. So,
seriously?
yeah, yeah, that was yesterday, and we're
Wow.
still feeling some aftershocks today. But fortunately, I wasn't in, I was far enough away that I felt it, and it definitely shook our house, but we didn't really have too many damages, so that's good.
Wow. Similar, but I mean, everything is just hyper right now because of
Yeah,
what's going on with COVID. Last night we lost power
dang.
about 10 o'clock at night, and I'm just like, luckily, luckily I looked outside and everybody else's power, and I'm like, okay, good, it's just me.
Yeah.
The zombie apocalypse, it might just be my house, not everybody else's.
Right,
Uh,
exactly, right.
yeah.
I think it comes down to kind of what you said. Everything's a little hypersensitive right now, so any little thing is kind of throwing us
Yes.
off a little bit.
Well, even today, right? We had this meeting scheduled for an hour and a half ago, or whatever it was, and I had something. I had to bump it because of something we've got going on at school. You had to bump it because you were going to do something else and got hung up. Like, there's just like a level of patience and understanding with everybody. I think will go a long way towards getting through this thing.
Definitely,
Yeah.
definitely.
So before we get into the meat and potatoes of what we want to talk about, I'm Mike Vanderpool. I am a faculty member at Northwest State Community College. I teach visual communication, graphic design. I also have a background in instructional design, instructional coaching, learning experience design, whatever you want to call it. And I'm here today with Kyle Cooper, who LinkedIn connection. We've never met face to face. We just
Yeah.
started talking 2 or 3 days ago, right? We're already good friends, right? First time we talked, kids were screaming in the background and everything like
Yeah.
that, right? Um, but Kyle, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we can kick off what we want to talk about today, which is really some best practices and things to consider with remote instruction.
Definitely. Yeah. So thanks, Michael. Yeah, my name's Kyle. So my by trade, I'm an instructional designer. So my experience is mostly in how do you create content that's going to be effective in really any environment. But one of the primary things that I do, a big client that I service is Canvas, which if you're not familiar, they're an online LMS used by um, a lot in academics, K-12 and higher ed. You'll see it in both markets. And so a big part of what I do is travel around teaching people how to make their courses effective in Canvas. And while, I think it's interesting because a lot of these same principles that I teach when I'm talking about Canvas, they apply really anywhere. So I'd like to think that I'm also I know a little bit about online learning, how to turn your classroom environment into an online environment and do it in a way that leverages the benefits of online learning rather than just seeing online learning as we have to do it because of either COVID-19 or because we teach online classes to remote students. But there are actually some benefits that you can glean from having a remote environment. So I think there's things that you can leverage. Anyway, um, yeah, I've been doing that for a few years. So that's kind of my background.
Nice. How'd you get involved in it? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I fell into most of my background is actually in corporate education.
Hmm.
So I started at a job and kind of moved my way up the ranks, and then made it to where I was training people, and found that I really had a pretty strong passion for it. Really enjoyed teaching people new things and learning new things because when you're in corporate education, a lot of times you're expected to learn something and then teach it. And then just through my experience, I became acquainted with Canvas actually through a LinkedIn connection. I'm a huge fan of LinkedIn because if it wasn't for LinkedIn, I never would have gotten involved with Canvas. Basically, I reached out to somebody at Instructure, the developers of Canvas, and said, "Hey, I love your product, love your service." I was applying for jobs, trainer jobs at the time,
Hmm.
but I didn't even get an email back. I just didn't have the credentials they were looking for. So in this case, I had to make a personal connection. So I connected with, this was almost 5 years ago, connected with somebody who's not even there anymore, but his name was Micah. He was a training manager at the time. And I said, "Hey, let's do lunch, let's chat." Kind of got to know each other a little bit. And then from there, just kind of kept in touch, and that turned into a working relationship. So
Nice.
yeah, I've been doing it ever since.
Nice. So one of the things I think we want to start off with talking about online learning, remote learning, is one of the fears that I know a lot of people have, specifically the learners, and that is this fear of being on an island and isolated. I've
Yeah.
even experienced it where I teach a face-to-face class and it has the same students that are in an online class. And in the
Yeah.
online class, they don't feel like they're allowed to even talk about it outside of the online environment, which is just, it's just wild, right? That wall
Huh.
that's invisibly put up, like this island, like I'm taking
Yeah.
online almost for some people's like I'm on an island. They
Yeah.
might not even know who the instructor is. They don't know who their peers are. They think it is all on me, isolated, to make this happen. I think that's where, you know, as we move to remote, we're hearing from a lot of learners like, "Hey, I took face to face for a reason. I don't like online. Dear God, don't make me do online."
Yeah.
So let's try to alleviate some of the concerns with how we structure our courses and content as
Yeah.
we move to online remote delivery. But then also, like, I think it's important, one of the first things I wanted to talk about with you was, you know, the communication protocols.
Yeah.
How am I as a faculty member going to communicate with students? Because our LMSs, learning management systems, offer, I mean, we've got email. Our learning management systems usually have a messaging system put inside of there. There's also the discussion boards and forums. What are some of the ways that you think communicating to students can be streamlined to alleviate, or used to alleviate some of that island, I'm on an island all alone mentality?
Yeah, you know, that's a really good question. And I think it could go a lot of different directions as far as the answers. But the overall thing that I would say right off the bat is, as an admin or as a teacher, you need to make sure you're adapting to what your students are comfortable with and what your students are going to use. Because it doesn't make sense. I've seen some instructors say, "Hey, I use email, so you need to use email." But the funny thing about email is, and my experience has taught me that most students, we're talking about K-12 and higher ed, email's not really, it's something that we use in the professional world, but it's not something that students grow up using that much, is what I found. They're
Mm-hmm.
far more comfortable with Facebook Messenger, with, you know, using the Snapchat, stuff like that. So if you can, I mean, even texting, there are different tools available that you can, and I don't have any right off the bat, but there's tools available that you can use that will leverage the methods that students are comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
So, and of course, there's concerns, especially in K-12. You can't just use anything to, you know, in regards to privacy, you can't just use anything. But you ought to consider, I mean, when it comes to Canvas, and I know that a lot of LMS applications will do the same thing. I encourage instructors to use methods in the LMS, so then students can use the mobile app and they'll get push notifications to their phone,
Mm-hmm.
which is something they're going to be far more familiar with compared to email, if that makes sense. Does that kind
Yeah,
of
yeah,
help?
100%. I use Slack.
Okay.
I set up a Slack instance for my program, and each class has its own channel. The way I set it up originally was it's not required, but this is like the extra stuff that, you know, in my travels, I find a video or something here that relates to the course content. It's not required, but it's probably cool if this is something that you're into, and was using it for that. So now me communicating, Sakai, I actually turned off the messaging system internal to Sakai, only because it just basically would forward to an email anyway.
Hmm.
So I removed that option because sometimes it didn't work, and then
Yeah.
that became an issue. But I'm communicating to students right now through the Slack application, through email, I should say, not messaging in Sakai, but we have announcements in Sakai,
Yeah.
and I think Canvas has a similar feature that
Yeah.
that creates a static message in the LMS under announcements, but then also pushes out as an email to everybody.
Right. Yep.
And then for my program, I've got a social media account that's basically, sometimes if it's sensitive information, I just say, "Hey, people in this class, check your email," or, "Hey,
Hmm.
I'm doing some invitations to Google Calendar for class," just general, as much as possible to meet the students where they are with this. I also know there's the Remind app and Rave Alerts. There's all kinds of things that
Yeah.
people are using. I think for the most part, it's being clear and consistent and reinforcing with your students the primary methods by which I'm going to communicate official things.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. And I think any of those options that you talked about are really good. I think the most important thing is finding a solution that uses push notifications. Because students use their cell phones now. That's how they communicate. And
Yeah.
it might feel a little awkward to say that, hey, you have 4 or 5 different apps. One is used for one class, one is used for another class. But to be honest, that's what our students are doing now. They use Messenger, they use texting, they use WhatsApp, they use Snapchat. So the idea that they have a different messaging system, they're comfortable with that as long as they can receive the notifications the same way, which is through your phone push notifications.
Mhm.
So if you can find a solution that works well for students, that will push to their phones, that's probably the best way. But again, part of this challenge is kind of figuring out, hey, how do your students communicate?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So from there, I think what are some of the best practices now with regard to how you set up the LMS for, I think, chunking content, right? That's the one thing I think we're going to have to understand, that in this more chaotic environment, resetting into what you're doing, if we can't just give students one big huge document and expect them to find what they need in there, parsing out this content, chunking it in a way that makes sense. What are some of the methods that you use maybe with Canvas and other LMSs for dividing
Yes.
content up?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm glad that you brought up the whole chunking thing. It's kind of a buzzword right now, but I think it definitely applies here. So we should be listening to this suggestion of chunking out our content, especially when it comes to online, because when we teach in a brick and mortar environment, we tend to chunk things naturally. We'll teach them day by day, or we'll teach them week by week. And so as a result, we're breaking out our content very naturally. But the problem is that I see with a lot of instructors, especially when they're making their first switch to online, is they will take all of their content and throw it into their LMS at the same time. So instead of chunking it out, they'll go and throw it all in. And that creates, really, it's almost like the metaphor I always use when I'm teaching new instructors is, it's almost like getting a box, and you consider all the things that you hand out during the year, all the worksheets, all the quizzes, all the your syllabus, all that paperwork, all that stuff that you distribute, making 20 copies of it, put them all in their respective boxes, and then distributing a box to each student, and putting the responsibility on the student to maintain and keep that paperwork up to date throughout the course of an entire year. Mm-hmm. And whenever I give that metaphor in a classroom, teachers right away, they know that's not a good idea for multiple reasons. It sounds convenient because I can get everything done up front, right? I can front load all my work and get it all done at the beginning of the year, but it's just not going to work. And I'm going to end up having just as much work throughout the year, because students are going to be asking me, what happened to this? Where's this? I lost this. I can't find this. So it really doesn't help your students, and it really doesn't help you as the instructor. So kind of what you were coming back to there, Michael, was chunking your content, breaking that content down. And there's really 2 ways that you can do that in your LMS. One way is basically breaking it down into either your files. So a lot of LMS applications will have file systems. So you can organize your content into a file structure that, you have a file that's week 1, and then you've got your content in week 1.
It would be like a week 1 folder, or a module 1 folder, and then
yeah,
okay,
exactly. So you've got files, and then there's other. I know Canvas uses the tool that I usually recommend when I'm teaching Canvas is modules. I recommend it hands down. I don't know how that applies to all other LMS applications, but modules is a little bit more flexible and dynamic in the way that you can provide content to students, which
especially as content becomes more multimodal, right? Like we have some 8-week classes, some 16-week classes, some boot camp style classes. Defining things by weeks and days doesn't always translate to, or make it easy to translate your content into a different scenario.
Yeah.
So I use modules myself, and some modules are 1 week, some modules are 2, some are 3.
Yeah.
in a
And
traditional 15-week environment.
really what it comes down to when you're chunking your content, because sometimes instructors have a hard time chunking their content because they're already an expert.
Mm-hmm.
So where they think all this content can be combined because they understand it all in one context of one another, it might be too much for the student. If you're concerned about that, or if you're not sure, or you're finding your modules really are expanding too much to where they're so large, you know you need to break them into smaller pieces, I would actually get one of the best things you can do is just get a second set of eyes on it. Someone who
Right.
is not experienced with maybe your material, so they can look at it from a student's perspective to see if it can easily be structured mentally by the way that you have organized your content.
Mm-hmm.
So leverage your other faculty members, leverage other instructors, and just ask them, say, hey, can you take a look at my course? And viewing from the perspective of a student who's never seen my content before, does it feel relevant? Does it make sense? Is it something you can follow? A good question to ask yourself is, if a student were to access your course, would they know what the next step is? Do they know where to go next? And if the answer is no, then you need to consider restructuring your content.
One of the features that Sakai has, and I'm interested if Canvas does, is there's a checklist feature.
Okay.
So at the top of a page, which could be a module, I can actually put in a checklist of all the things to go through in that module. And what's awesome is the students can check that off individually as they go, but then in the back end, I can see who's actually checked stuff off. And what I've found, anecdotally, this isn't like a real study, but the students who start off using that checklist end up performing better, even though they stop using it later on, because when they first enter that environment, they're still getting used to it, right? This whole idea that learners are tech savvy and can do anything and everything in the tech space does not hold, especially with LMSs. So is there something like that native in Canvas, or people could probably
not directly to what you're referencing, if I understand it right, but there are similar functions in Canvas where you can actually assign requirements in the modules. So when you create a chunk of content, or in Canvas it'd be considered a module, when you create a chunk of content, you can designate what it means to complete that module. So you can say, in order to be able to complete this content, you need to score a certain number on an assignment, or maybe you just need to submit the assignment. Right. There's not a bar per se, but it's just a matter of, like you say, a checklist sign that we're saying, yes, we complete this task. So there are ways that you can signal students to help them understand whether or not they're following your content in an effective way.
The other thing too, I think in Canvas, can't users, if it's just a page of text for them to view or a page of a video or whatever, they can mark that done, correct? And there's
exactly. Yeah. So they can come in and say, yeah, I actually read this. And the benefit of that, because sometimes teachers get a little bit confused sometimes. They think, well, a checklist doesn't help students learn. And it's true. If somebody just checks all the boxes, they're not necessarily learning. But what it does is it helps the student create a framework in their mind. Because when we're learning, it's not, what we're doing is we're making connections from topic A to topic B to topic C, and we're making those connections. But when we receive information kind of all haphazardly, all at once, it can be difficult to see how they connect. But a checklist gives students a framework of, hey, if I start with topic A, then topic B will make better sense, and topic C will then continually build on each other. So it's not that the checklist is necessarily the learning tool itself, but it gives that framework and guidance to students, which is what they need, right?
Yeah, and I think too, if we look at Canvas pages or other pages inside of LMSs, you don't have to have all of your content for one topic on one single page. Think about how you would break things out with headings, and those could be different headings for different pages, because what I find is sometimes when we create content, we produce it for what we expect the user to go through at one time only.
Yeah.
Versus how our students, our learners are going back and trying to find things. And it's an online class, you're taking multiple online classes, where are things? Like having more pages that are clearly labeled what they are, I think is a huge benefit than just trying to put everything into a single page for a single module.
100%, for multiple reasons.
Yeah.
One, because of the reason that you just mentioned, that, you know, going back and finding content, which is students are doing when they're studying. If they're needing to go back, and by studying, I mean even completing assignments. When they go to
Hmm.
complete an assignment, they're going to have to reference the content that you've provided. And so that's totally true. When you break your content out, it makes it easier for students to find things. But the other piece I was going to mention is it makes it easier for, right now there's a big buzz in corporate learning around micro learning, which you
Hmm.
can think what you want of it, but the reality is, and this is kind of interesting, Canvas has data, user data on how much time do students spend on a given page or on their mobile device, because most students are actually accessing Canvas on their mobile devices.
Right.
And it's found that most students don't spend more than like 3 to 6 minutes on a given page. And what that means is if your page is mega long, they're not even finishing that page. So what it comes down to is if you break that content out, they can open up the mobile app and read a page quickly and then come back to it later, and be able to find where they left off versus, you know, having a big long text.
And I think, and sorry, and this is just going to be off the top of our heads as we go, right? One
No
of the things
worries.
one of the things I think too that we could probably do as instructors is give students an indication, excuse me, of, you know what, this is something you could digest in a 15-minute chunk.
Yeah.
This is something that, you know what, you're really going to have to sit down and think about for an hour or so. And giving them the learner that indication lets them plan around their time around what they're going to try to do, because it doesn't make sense if this is something that's deep and going to need all my brain power. Maybe riding on the bus for 15 minutes and watching it isn't the best time for me to access this content.
Yeah, I think so. I think the biggest signal that you can give to students about how much time they should spend into content is giving them an understanding of why they're learning it to begin with, or what's the
Yeah.
expectation after. So
Yeah.
if they're going to be reading content and that content will be relevant for a large project later, bring the project up at the beginning and say, look, here's the project that you're going to be completing. Now here's all your content, or here's this content that's relevant to the project.
Yeah, that's really good, because then, right, I think one of the things that we run into sometimes is learning as an end unto itself, like learning for the sake of learning, which I totally respect. But if we think about it, most people learning as a means towards an end of something I'm able to do later, and framing it that way, right? Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
I hear you, because I'm a big fan of learning for the sake of learning, but the reality is most of our students, that's not why they're there.
Right.
And
Right.
to really engage your students, giving them a purpose in what you're doing is going to be far better
Right.
for their experience.
One other thing I think that plays into this is naming conventions. Think about our learners who are going to download something and want to be able to access it later. All of our files, all of our modules, everything, please include the course number,
Yeah.
the module number, and what the topic is, right? Because a file xyz123.mp4 means nothing to me if I'm downloading it for access later.
Yeah.
Naming your file, naming conventions. I beat it into my students. Every assignment they submit starts with VCT-103 or whatever the numbers are. That way, when I download them, thank you. Thank you. I needed a water. I was going to.
No worries.
Even then, you know, thinking about your user, I think it's user experience, right? Like if I'm going to download something and store for later, or even be able to retrieve in the LMS inside of the file structure that's there, folder file structure there, having the name of what things are is hugely valuable to our learners. Reduce that cognitive load of where was that.
Yes, totally. I mean, imagine the difference between you know, when you're looking at something that's organized. I'm glad you brought up cognitive load, because those naming conventions play a huge factor in that. When students can't understand the structure of your course, when they can't understand the naming of your course and how to find things, chances are their learning is going to decline in the content that they're actually there to learn as well. So just to echo that, that's a simple thing, but it's forgotten a lot of times, because in the convenience, we want to just upload the file and give it the name whatever it had originally. But it makes a big difference for your students when you adjust things to meet their needs.
And I think too, this comes from my own experience doing my master's in instructional design online.
Yeah.
I was taking 3-4 classes at a time, being presented with all kinds of great information.
Yeah.
But I couldn't even tell you the name of some of the classes I took, right? Because everything looks really similar in the LMS.
Yeah.
Going back and trying to reference things that I know that was somewhere, man, that just sucked when it came near the end and I was working on my final project. Like, man, where was this?
Yeah.
And it's in 4 or 5 different courses. Could have potentially be in 4 or 5 different courses, at least 30, 40 different modules. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, yes. Hey, speak of working from home. Hello, son. Hello. This is the new reality for a lot of us.
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
Say hi and bye.
Say hi, Kyle.
How's it going,
Say
buddy?
bye, Kyle.
Bye, Kyle.
Let's go find your purse. Sorry, I went to check on Jonathan.
That's all good. My son is an escape artist.
That's okay.
Yeah.
The,
Yeah, go ahead.
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna, I don't know,
Yeah. Why don't we switch gears a little bit? I know you wanted to talk a little bit about engaging students, because I know that's a major complaint for students and faculty. But part of the reason that a lot of people become instructors and become teachers is because they like that idea of kind of mentoring and engaging and helping build somebody. And it feels, the reality is sometimes it can feel like we get less of that when we're in an online environment, right?
Right.
One of the things, though, that I think is important to note is online courses today are far different than they were even just 10 years ago. And
Can I stop you there?
Yeah,
Because
go for it.
online courses, it's only been 20 years, which is nothing in the grand scheme.
Yeah, it's not
of
very
time, right?
long.
Yeah. And the way I understand it started was, here's a course shell, faculty, you do something with this. And that's basically how our online has evolved. So go ahead.
Yeah, well, now the idea is now we have so many more resources available if we're willing to use them when we create an online course. And the goal here is to create a course that's going to be, hello. We want to create a course that's going to be engaging to students rather than just something that we take all our content and again, get that online textbook idea. We're trying to avoid just creating an online textbook.
Yes.
So one of the little things, it's the little things that count, but one of the little things that can really make a difference in your engagement is actually what we're doing right now. Creating a video of yourself where you're willing to put yourself on camera makes an enormous difference in engaging your students. And this applies on many different levels, but when you give an assignment, maybe consider giving that through the form of a video rather than just text. When you are creating a discussion, get in front of your camera. It doesn't have to be perfect. I mean, you see my office is kind of thrown together right now.
You see, my office is invaded by minions.
That's how it goes sometimes. And that's real life. That's the reality of remote working. And
Yes.
There might be some instances where you have to kind of buckle down, but most of the time it's like, look, people know and they expect that when you're doing remote videos.
Well, and I think too, from my experience online, everybody, I don't want to say everybody, but a lot of times in online environments, we don't see the other person on the other side of the wire as a human.
Yeah.
And I have great evidence of, a conversation I had with when I was an instructional coach and mentor, whatever it was, and instructor was having issues with a student online.
Yeah.
It was a totally online deliverable class. The instructor didn't want to ever show their face on the camera, even at the beginning of the conversation, 30 seconds, and then shut it off. So that person was seen kind of just like, they weren't even seen as a person. I got on the phone call or on a chat with a learner, and I don't think it was video chat, but they could hear the dog and the kids in the background.
Yeah.
And he said, I'm paraphrasing, "Yeah, I can't yell at you. You're a real person." And I'm like, yes. So all those hyper tensions and everything, I think, get lowered when we actually realize I'm a person just trying to make the best of the situation, just like you right now.
Yeah, totally. Turning your camera on and getting engaged. And one thing I'd recommend, if you don't have the ability to do that on a regular basis, just because of circumstances, try to do it at least once a week. So if you're doing some of your discussions via text and not everything is done on the camera, see what you can do to connect. Like, for example, we'll talk about online discussions because that's a common thing in many LMS applications.
That was my master's project. My master's was all discussions.
Nice. They need a lot of work. I got to be honest. And I'm talking about in practice. We know a lot more about them, but we're not necessarily practicing a lot of great things when it comes to online discussions.
This is
in
where
an academic environment.
This is where I could rant, so I'm going to avoid ranting.
Well, so
I'm interested to hear your thoughts for sure.
Yeah, my thoughts on discussions are they're usually most effective and by effective I mean it creates a learning experience when you connect it with something else that will engage students. When you create a discussion and say, hey, here's a video, now give me a mandatory response that's like 50 words or more on the video, what you're doing is you're pigeonholing that student into, all I have to do, I don't even have to learn anything from the video, I just have to plug in any response to the video, right? Whereas if you give them the video and say, hey, we're going to watch the video, go ahead and give a discussion or give your thoughts, even if you didn't have anything in particular, mention that. Say, there wasn't a whole lot I got from this, but know that this discussion is going to be followed up with our conference room discussion in 2 days. And I'm going to ask you about what you learned or what you saw in the video. And at that point, I think students would realize, I need to actually glean something from this. So I might be willing to watch the video and maybe even rewatch the video at certain parts to see what I can get out of this content.
100%. So many people see discussion boards as busy work, especially when you throw in those protocols of 250 words and reply to 2 people. There's studies that prove that actually stifles discussions.
Yeah. Well, I know it does.
Yeah.
And my experience is anecdotal, right? But I know I've been in discussions when I'm like, you know what, let's just get this over with. I'm going to type my response and I'm done.
If you're a faculty member who's counting words, you're doing it wrong.
I agree 100%. It's
one of the things that I think some studies show is that student questions that come out of watching the content and presented as a discussion are much more engaging than the questions that we pose as faculty.
Yeah. I totally agree.
I've got a rubric I'll share with you offline here, off of this, about how I grade discussions. Which
nice. I'd be really interested to see that.
Yeah, it's more about the quality of the content and the contribution to the learning community than it is the requirements of 250 words and word counts. But discussions are hard because they're often buried in the LMS.
Yeah.
Think about Facebook and think about Twitter and all these things that have the same prompt that we'll rant on and make comments on all day for, right? The very first thing you see is what's on your mind.
Yeah.
Our LMSs bury those discussions at least 2, 3, if not more clicks to get to those things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Discussions are definitely, I don't know, they're interesting. I've seen them used effectively, and I'm not going to say that they're not good, because I have seen them used effectively, but when we try to pigeonhole them into, I have to have a discussion every single week, or I have to have a discussion on, when we create rules around our discussions, they tend to make those conversations that happen in the forum far less genuine.
Yeah.
While the tool can be used, I think if it's overused, and then what happens is then we create a culture around discussions. So then in the few times when we have them and they are in an effective place, students are so accustomed to discussions having no value that they just
100%
pass by the discussion. So it's important that you don't, use them when they would be valuable, and then when they're not, don't try to force it on them.
And it's interesting because, I think online discussions were kind of modeled over classroom discussions, or everything online kind of is meant to model or replace something face-to-face. When we have a face-to-face discussion, what percentage of the people in the room actually participate verbally in the discussion?
That's
But
so that's so funny that you say that, because that's totally true.
yeah,
In the discussion online, we expect, hey, everybody has to say something. But would we really do that in a classroom? Um,
no, we would probably like
Probably not.
what I do is I break them into groups in the classroom, and then they would present something as a group or whatever. And you can use some of those tools in an online environment as well. That
Yeah.
I think gets to the same point of the discussions. The same token, right? Sitting in a classroom, two people having a conversation with the faculty, the people who are there listening may be engaging more heavily than even the people who are talking, because they're actually thinking about stuff.
Right.
Versus there's also somebody in that room who's on their phone or in La La Land, and they're farther away from in actual distance than anybody even in an internet connection millions of miles away.
Well, that's the concept that you just shared is totally true in all online forums. When you talk about Facebook, somebody puts a comment on Facebook. Do you think the only people who are engaged in that conversation, and by engaged, I mean, they're reading it and they're thinking about it. Do you think the only people engaged are those who comment?
Yeah, exactly.
No, right? There's tons of people that like it, and then there's tons of people that don't even like it. They just read it, and then they turn to their, whoever's in the room with them, and they say, "I can't believe what so-and-so just posted on Facebook." So
it's like Amazon product reviews, right? Not everybody leaves a review.
yeah,
but
so
they still bought the darn thing.
Well, and what we do, the hard part is imagine if on Facebook you made a comment and the comment only showed up for somebody if they were willing to, or it really could only be used if everybody participates. I mean, what it would turn into is people would never read the comments, because there'd be so many garbage comments. Basically, people threw comments in there that are there just because they had to, that nobody's going to read the comments because it's just a bunch of fluff.
and I think that's the one thing that if we want to get back to what discussions are about, they should provide value to the learner. So much so that I'm going to participate whether it's graded or not.
Yeah.
And what has happened is we've put on the protocols of word counts. We also, I think in some discussions, have the feature, don't show anybody's reply until I make a reply. Like there's all kinds of stuff that we've added on to the system to try to solve for the problem of, no, your discussion questions just aren't good.
Yeah.
But
And it comes back to what's the purpose, right? I'm glad you mentioned that. What's the purpose? I've seen, if you ask every student to introduce themselves, of course it's acceptable to require every student to actually respond, because those are introductions. But if you're asking a kind of a critical thinking question and you're wanting students to think about it, there's like you said, and
this might be kind of interesting. So I was working on some competency-based education stuff back in the day. And competency-based education, you could have one person in a class, right? Yeah. And so one of the ways potentially to have that person participate in a discussion would be to present a discussion, a threaded discussion on the topic, and have the learner summarize that. So instead of requiring posts as what's graded at the end of the week or the end of the module, no, you're going to summarize the discussion that was had in this forum throughout the whole module. So if people don't contribute to that discussion, and the discussion can be open-ended of sharing resources, ideas, whatever.
Yeah.
Then that's helping like the facilitating more with the classroom discussions of bringing up questions and things. And then a summary of those things is a way to check for understanding or check for participation if that's what you're actually aiming for. What are you really aiming for with your discussion? Again, back to purpose.
Yeah. I haven't thought about it that way. I'm probably going to use that now when I talk about discussions, because it's a difficult thing to teach. I'll be honest, because the series of bad discussions has made its rounds in online education. So it's kind of become the normal thing. But I think things are kind of shifting. People are recognizing. So
there's one other. So I coded a whole new discussion board platform as part of my master's project, trying to solve some of this. And one of the issues I ran into was just relationships of how posts appear in the actual content, right? So if I've got like a 2 or 3 paragraph response, because that's what is warranted, and somebody wants to respond to that, well, they're not responding to the whole thing typically. they're responding
Yeah.
to a sentence or a phrase or something, like trying to make those connections of what I'm actually commenting on
Yeah.
is I think that's the next phase of where discussion boards kind of go.
Huh.
We can have a more threaded discussion without, because right, I could be replying to a top post and that's so far down that I can't even see the post it's referring to in the comment back, and it's just real hard to make sense of the conversation, I think, with how discussions are laid out right now. But I digress.
Yeah, no, that's okay. That's really interesting. Cool. Well, yeah, I mean, as far as engagement, I don't know that I have a whole lot more advice other than, you know, the easiest one, if you're not doing it already, is start using your camera.
Yeah.
And then there are other things, you know, if you really wanted to find out how you could make a particular or specific assignment engaging, I mean, that's where we could have a conversation. But general advice that I think applies to everyone is, you know, think about the purpose that you're trying to get across whenever you create online content. And then also, you know, use your camera and engage with students directly. And it's okay to do that in messages. It's okay to do that in assignments. If your camera, you know, if you only show up on camera one time in your entire online course, you're probably not engaging the students really.
Yeah. If they don't know your name after the fact,
Yeah,
if they've taken a
exactly.
course with you and don't know your name or couldn't pick you out of a lineup,
Yeah. Then you haven't really connected with that student.
Yeah.
So, Michael, I have another meeting at 11:30.
Nope, that's good. That's good. I think, you know, that we've given people a lot of digestible content. I'm going to go ahead and post-produce this. I'll get a transcript up and some other stuff, and I'll share it. I don't think I mean, I can let you proof it if you want, but I don't think we gave away any trade secrets. What's the best way for people to get a hold of you if they want to follow up?
You know, LinkedIn's probably the best way to get in contact with me if they want to follow up. If you want me to review some of your course, especially with this coronavirus stuff going on,
right.
I've kind of made an effort to reach out to at least the academic community. If you're wanting me to take a look at your course, I mean, we can spend a good 15, 20 minutes just looking at things. I can give you a few tips. Yeah, LinkedIn is, I mean, if you want to know more, then reach out to me on LinkedIn.
And you know what? I've got some courses I'm going to be, because I teach design and I teach by the seat of my pants. In all honesty, like I just make it up as I go, just because I do. But now with things going online, remote, I've got to give a little bit more structure because I don't necessarily have the day-to-day, and I want to make students feel a little bit more comfortable as they're transitioning to this. But one of the things we can do, you know, if we want to follow up with this maybe next week or the next week or two when things shake out a little bit, is go through a module that I've designed and we can talk about it. You can give me some tips and we can show people maybe something like that.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. That would be great.
Awesome. All right, Kyle, find Kyle Cooper on LinkedIn, find me on LinkedIn, and we'll just continue to make it happen.
Awesome. Cool. Hey, thanks, Michael. I appreciate it.
Take care, man.
All right. Ciao.